quite interesting.
Welcome everyone to In the Hot Seat. If you're a repeat viewer, thank you for joining us again. And if you're new to the show, every 2 weeks we put industry experts and or customers in the hot seat for what we hope is a lively discussion, a little debate, maybe even some discourse as we try to humanize the digital experience. All aspects of the customer life cycle are up for discussion, as well as all the underlying technologies throughout each phase of the journey. Now, if you're a regular watcher, you know we usually do series, and this is the first episode in a new series that we're working on customer experience. And today we're going to look at one of the hottest topics, honestly, around these days, creating content that is responsive to real-time customer behavior and context.
And from a consumer point of view, businesses suck. This is probably one.
Well, I mean, that is a fairly well-held opinion. I was pulling some survey data up so we'd have a few things to kick around, and I got this one from McKinsey. 71% of customers expect personalized experiences, but 76% express frustration that they don't receive them.
And on the other hand, we are inconsistent too. I mean, if I am looking at another statistics that we pulled, is what are we looking at when buying? And it's not really important for us to get a high level of personalization. This sort of is at the bottom of the list, and still we are frustrated. So this is quite interesting. This dichotomy. Oh my God, this contrast.
Dichotomy, yeah, you got it. Well, you know, the thing is, there's always been a mismatch, I think, and it's like one of the Twilio surveys that I looked at. 85% of companies believe they provide personalized experiences, and 60% of their customers agreed. That's a pretty big gap.
Although, in contrast to the Qualtrics one, that is 2 or 3 years older, where the gap narrowed a little. So that's at least the good news. So, but still, the other topic is, what data do they use? Do they use data that I willingly share, or do they just buy together using this Flock thing and just combine aggregate data that may or may not be relevant at all, and which actually I'm not feeling comfortable them use? So the whole trust topic in personalization and delivering the content based on that is still to be addressed.
I mean, I think the interesting thing, and we'll get into this, I think, during the show, but I you know, we do want personalized experiences, and there's a lot of proof that especially from a content perspective, personalizing the content is very impactful, right? But at the same time, you know, there is a lot of privacy concern around it, but the thing is, a lot of what we're trying to do is actually using behavioral real-time data that they collect based on what you're doing on the web. So I don't know, that's an interesting issue, I think.
But hey, who are we to really talk about that? Maybe
well, why don't we bring in an expert? Is that what you're thinking? Well, so we're lucky to be joined by Nicole France today, and Nicole and I are old friends. And Nicole, you've had a lot of experience with thought leadership and content manager of thought leadership at Cisco, 3 years of Constellation as a principal analyst and VP. I know you were just left Contentful after about a 4-year stint as an evangelist and chief evangelist there. And now I understand you're having lots of fun working on some family businesses, right?
That is indeed the case. Yeah. So I've been busy doing stuff much more consumer focused. Very small business. So the adjustment to not having teams of people to do all the stuff has been real. I think many of us have been there before. It's a stark contrast when suddenly you are not only the leader and director, but you are also the labor that is responsible for executing all the stuff. So it definitely focuses the mind. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, believe me, I left, as you know, I left G2 5 years ago now, and I started this business 4 years ago, and I delegated everything to me.
Yes, it's funny. It does make the team meetings a little more concise, shall we say?
They're certainly easier to schedule.
Yeah.
And one always knows who's the culprit.
Exactly.
So let's get into this a little bit, because I know you have some, we talked a little bit before the show, and I know there are a lot of things that have been happening from a content management, content marketing perspective. So can we just kind of level set a little bit? Talk about what does real-time responsive content actually mean, or dynamic content, whatever words you want to use in practice. And then how's that different? How is that better or worse than what we were doing before?
Oh, these are my favorite kinds of questions. And some of those I think don't get asked often enough. How is it different? I think a lot of people are working on this one. The way it's different in theory, at least in intent, is presenting content that is much more relevant to the recipient and the recipient's goals and priorities, right? Hopefully preferences as well, but sometimes that's a little bit harder to discern. So I think in that sense, it's different because it's more effectively tailored when we get it right. Is it everywhere? I mean, I think that is actually a really big and important debate. Where does this make sense is a big question that I think we as an industry are all trying to figure out. And as an industry, I mean the people doing this stuff for all of our customers and the audiences that we're trying to engage. Because I think that part of this is understanding where are you doing something that's in direct response. And you guys were just talking about this in the intro here. Where is this a direct response to a very explicit signal that someone is sending, either about what they want or what they're looking for? And where are we doing this from more of a speculative outbound kind of perspective? I mean, we talk about personalization in a marketing standpoint in terms of outbound messages. You know, what are we sending to somebody because we think we've done a better job at understanding what they're likely to be interested in or respond to. Right. And then there's also those in real time things where it's actually very much a reaction to something that the individual recipient is doing. And I think both of these are important. They're also different. Right? There might be some relationship between them, but they're not exactly the same. Is it better or worse? Like this is where I think that is an answer that is totally up for grabs. Yeah. And like in all things marketing and customer service, I would say the answer is very much it depends. I think we're getting better at understanding this stuff to some degree, but I also think there are not enough critical questions being asked about why we're doing it and whether it's actually achieving the goals. Because I think this is one of those areas where it's such a kind of land grab that everybody feels like they need to be doing it. And they often start down a path without really understanding what it is they expect to happen as a result of this. And, you know, this comes to some really interesting questions about whether there are metrics that tell us whether this is doing what we expect it to do, and probably equally, perhaps even more importantly, what that feels like and how that goes down with the audiences that we're trying to engage. And I think that's a much more qualitative answer that frankly gets far too often overlooked.
Directly following up on this, isn't it the customer at the end of the day who needs to decide whether it's better or worse?
I think yes, of course, right? I mean, we you guys, this is our favorite conversation. How many years have we been having it? Experiences are subjective. It really matters. You know, what does the recipient feel? What are they? You know, is it helping to accomplish their goals? Is it something that leaves them with the feeling we want them to have, as well as the outcome that we were trying to hopefully create for them, with them, all of these are important questions. But I think there are some interesting things we can track here, because not all of this is super conscious, right?
Mhm.
Some of this stuff, if it's done very effectively, the recipient might not necessarily know is happening. And I think in a lot of cases where that's done effectively, it's great. So things like information about my account or my relationship with a business, I shouldn't have to think about that being personalized to me. That should be automatic, and that should be really straightforward and effective. And if it is, I'm probably not giving it a passing thought, unless it's wrong, right? If it's wrong, that's when I notice.
Yeah.
Or it's creepy.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because I was just thinking about this as you're talking. Part of the way this has shifted, and I just had this experience recently, and so I'm curious how you think about this. But it seems like we're missing some context in some of the ways we're approaching this, and what I mean by that is I'm doing research and I'm out looking at agentic AI platforms, and I go through a few of them, and then all of a sudden I get inundated with, hey, we saw you're on our site and we thought you would want to do blah blah blah. Well, no, it's completely out of context, right? Totally out of context.
Yeah, this is like an amplified version of like, you were on our website, we think you're a hot lead and want to buy from us right away, right?
You might as well just put that in the headline, because that's what I thought. I mean,
yeah. No, and I think for me, there's for a very long time been a big missing area, which is having a hypothesis about what this behavior tells us and testing whether that hypothesis is accurate, rather than just jumping straight to an assumption and trying to push someone toward our desired outcome as the business and not necessarily their desired outcome as the business.
See, that's exactly the point, Nicole, I thought was interesting, because if they had sent me information, if they just shared some content, not tried to treat me as a lead, but just treat me as, hey, you stopped by, we have this white paper we thought you'd be interested in, that would have engaged me, and I might have read it, I might have followed up. But because it was completely out of context, and because it was blatantly an aggressive move to try to get more information from me, I there wasn't anything in it for me.
This is one of the really big issues, I think, in marketing broadly at the moment. And it kind of goes back to core principles versus metrics, because I think the core principle is, in any sort of good marketing and customer experience and customer engagement, you're trying to build a long-term relationship. You're trying to build an audience as much as a customer base, right? And we can talk about this. This is the whole idea of influence and influencers. And it's not just about loyal customers. It's sort of how you show up in the world, right? And that is a much wider audience than people who are currently your customers. And there may be a whole bunch of reasons for that. Maybe you have an aspirational brand. Maybe you are selling something that people only have an interest in, at a particular moment in time. Like, I am not constantly shopping for kitchen cabinets, but there are specific moments when I'm redoing a kitchen.
When you would be interested,
kitchen cabinets, right? So there are all these kinds of reasons why there's a Venn diagram that is not a complete overlap between audience and customer. Right. And I think this is part of what's missing. And I think traditional focus on branding understands this wider environment and ecosystem that we need to constantly be cultivating. And I think that the countervailing force is very much this idea of hardcore conversion metrics, which tends to be much, much more focused on demand and lead gen and much more short term. And I think the challenge for all kinds of businesses is trying to find the right balance between the short-term lead and demand gen and the longer-term, broader branding activities. And there's, of course, an overlap between these things. In a lot of cases, branding versus lead gen is in the eye of the beholder. As I said, if I'm shopping for kitchen cabinets, it's going to be lead gen. If I'm not in the market, if I'm not doing the kitchen right now, it's branding, right?
Yeah, it's just awareness, right? You just want to let you know that when you do need those cabinets, we're here.
Yes.
Isn't this only a quote unquote a mindset issue? Because at the end, if they can contact Michael, then they very easily can find out who he is. And this probably would give an indication that he's not in the market to buy an agentic AI solution, but he's about to analyze what's out there and who can benefit and
exactly.
why.
He is an important and influential voice that they should be aware of. Yes.
Yeah, but they should be reaching out to me in a different way. I mean, that's the point, right? Is how do you establish that context and how do you how do you as a marketer build a way to understand certain behavioral clues that lead you down a path to do certain things, right? I mean, that's a hard part.
Yeah, and I think again, this goes back to my example. Like part of that is analyzing behavioral patterns, and a lot of that is also actually delving into substance, right? It is actually doing the qualitative analysis, and heaven forbid, actually talking to someone. So, like there are ways of doing this. It's just that a lot of these things are given short shrift and overlooked because I think there is an overwhelming emphasis in many organizations on data. And data in many organizations only equals quantitative data. And a lot of it is exceedingly short term.
I mean, when it comes to intent identification, it better be short term and not kind of old data. But which probably also leads a little to the technology. And the technology is certainly there to identify Michael as a thought leader who may or may not want to promote one's brand or just create an awareness about what's out in the market and what the successes and failures are, instead of having a sales hunter hunt him down.
Yeah, right.
You're right about the recency of data, Thomas, but I also think part of this is understanding patterns over time and what that timeline actually looks like that's meaningful. Because I think, again, this is where the branding approach tends to recognize more of what I think is the reality, which is these relationships are not necessarily short-term or punctual in the moment. Some things are, and part of this is understanding what the appropriate time frame is to analyze and to understand, but a lot of these are much longer term relationships. I mean, we've all spent time in the B2B space where you might have a 2-year sales cycle on a very large deal, right? So looking at what happens in a 2-week marketing activity sprint is not actually going to be very helpful.
So I'm curious about the technology underneath this, though, because I mean, what we're talking about from a content perspective, it's not easy. And we're talking about the capability to serve up content that changes dynamically based on some behavioral clues or context, right? So how do you set that up from a technology perspective, and particularly around the data infrastructure? That must be quite a challenge.
It is. And I think part of the challenge on the data infrastructure side is that there are many, many ways to skin the cat. And this is one of the things that we used to say often at Contentful, along with the ecosystem of partners that Contentful works with, and it's not specific to Contentful, it's really about this entire technology approach, is that there is no single right way to do it. And that is definitely part of the beauty of this, but it is also a very significant challenge. And I think the same is very true when it comes to the data. Where is it? Where do you collect it? Where do you pull it together? How do you manage and apply it? There's no single answer, and there's not necessarily a right answer. There might be many right answers. There might even be multiple right answers for one organization, right? The trick is to get to them. And it is actually something that I think requires a sort of journey mindset, because first of all, we're all still trying to figure out how to do this stuff really effectively. That in and of itself is an ongoing process. So assuming that you can put something in place and it's going to work and you don't have to keep managing it is a fallacy. So number one, let's just recognize that. I think the second thing is that the systems and the processes that feed into doing that are all in a state of flux as well, partly because we're looking at new technologies that are making it easier and better, right? Part of it is because our own understanding and ability to interpret this stuff and identify what's really meaningful, for example, dynamically creating audience segments, or actually leaning into the power of AI to help us identify audience segments, is a really big deal. This is an incredibly powerful thing. But, and, you know, Thomas, you mentioned trust earlier, which is a big one here. Part of it is, do the people in the organization trust what these recommendations are from these systems? And, you know, I've certainly heard anecdotes of customers who have started using AI tools to identify audience segments. And what really helped is when the analytics team had spent several weeks building out and identifying these audience segments, and the AI tools were able to find the same audience segments very, very quickly. That is something that I think is part of this organizational learning process that is important to not only learning how to use these tools, but feeling confident that their application is correct, shall we say. So again, this is another aspect of how this stuff is changing, but this is where we get to some really cool stuff, you know, and it's you know, what pathway do you lead someone down? You know, what information are you presenting them next? How are you interacting and engaging with them? These are all questions that we can more and more effectively automate more or less in real time, but it's based on that understanding. And that's the part that AI is not going to automatically do, certainly not anytime soon, and understanding who are those audiences, why do we care about them, what do we know that matters to them, what do we know about their motivations, and how do we more effectively respond to and anticipate their needs. So, you know, the tools are allowing the automation of that execution. It's only going to be effective if we're actually tackling those bigger kind of conceptual and strategic questions that the tool is not going to be able to do, in my opinion, anytime soon.
You said a couple of times something like present content, create content, personalize content, which is actually the actual thing that one wants to do as a business. So, but how does this, the underlying content, so the underlying information, how does this need to be structured so that it can be delivered in a very tailored way, addressing current interests, current behavioral signs? And does this structure actually matter in times of generative AI?
I think it does matter. It certainly matters from an execution standpoint. And this is where the idea of structured content is really central to this whole movement. And the structure itself actually is not tied to any particular system. There are some systems that do better than others at actually helping you to build and manage that structure. And there are some ways in which you can, you know, actually have tools that separate some of that structure from the actual content management. That's a whole separate conversation, right? Again, many right answers, maybe a few wrong answers, but like no one right answer. But that structure is actually crucial to bridging the kind of human-computer divide, if you will. The structure makes it incredibly easy and quick for all sorts of digital channels, including AI tools, to consume and assimilate and execute based on this content. The modularity of that structure becomes exceedingly important because that's really what we're talking about. It's about rapid execution of modularity. Because I think the other thing that tends to get a little bit, in my opinion, too much emphasis is this idea of one-to-one. It all has to be one-to-one. It's like, well, okay, but what does that actually mean? It's not entirely distinct content every time. Like, seriously, how or why? I mean, it's always going to be modular. There's going to be some sort of structure to how you present that stuff. And even if what's being fed is, back to my earlier example, you know, account information, account history, interactions, sure, that stuff is all going to be unique, but the structure and how you present that maybe isn't, right? So it's about thinking of that modularity and structure. It makes it way easier to automate whether or not you're using AI tools, frankly, but it also provides structure that makes it really important for the humans in the system. What do we need to create? How do we use this stuff? Where do we need to fill the gaps? You know, what is the delta that we don't have that we need to be thinking about? If we're coming up with something entirely new, you know, what is it that we need to populate in order to make that happen? And here is where I think we're again seeing some really interesting opportunities for AI tools to help us identify, to help us create, to take those core ideas that are developed by the human teams and actually extend and derive other content from those things. So I think that's where we start to get to some really interesting accelerated stuff. how unique is the output? I mean, again, these are some very big and interesting questions. And in some cases, this is tied to regulatory and compliance issues. If you're a bank, if you're a healthcare provider of any kind, you know, there's certain forms of information, even things like pricing, you know, there are regulations that dictate how and where you present information, and that require in some cases an audit trail of what gets presented to people. So there are in some cases some very significant restrictions, shall we say, on what you actually want to do.
You now said a couple of times something like multiple right answers, no perfect answer, many wrong answers. So
At least a few. A few wrong answers.
Yeah. What would be a few? What would be a couple of good answers when it comes to the amount of personalization, the structure of data, or even the technology? Your choice.
I think I err on the side of simplicity here. And my reasoning for that is that it's very easy to get overcomplicated, and the more variables you're introducing into a system, the, you know, empirically far higher the chance that you're going to get something wrong. So I still think simplicity is the really important guiding principle. It also is important because, you know, back to your examples, Michael, of, you know, your actual reason for going on these websites, we may get very, very wrong about interpreting the meaning or intent behind what someone is doing. So if we keep things a little bit more simple and straightforward, you know, is it path A or path B kind of thing? Like, I think that's where we get to far more effective dynamic content and personalization. And we may end up being able to analyze some pathways that actually get to something very nuanced. But by not trying to overcomplicate it at the beginning, I think that's where we get to stuff that is both effective and actually meaningful, and hopefully drives the kinds of results that we're actually interested in, and teaches us something along the way, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting when you say that, because like if you think about the context of what I'm doing, I probably sent more intent signals than just the behavior of going to the website, right? Because what did I do? I probably looked at their profile on G2 before I went to that website, and I probably read 3 ZDNet articles about them before I went to that web. So I mean, I get that I'm probably a hard case, but that leads me to this kind of issue of how do we know what's signal and what's noise, and how to apply those things, right? Because that's difficult. Like I constantly get annoyed with LinkedIn, because I'm like, you could just read my profile and you know I don't need developers, but instead you send me 100 of those. I know, right? But if you're thinking about just content and serving content up that's individualized based on some behavior, it's a complex problem.
It is a complex problem, and here's where I think, again, AI has an incredibly huge potential to help us do better here. And part of the reason is because I think it allows us to much more quickly get to what might be small in terms of size, but highly meaningful customer segments. And this has always been the challenge, right? And this is part of the problem of doing all this stuff kind of manually, if you will, is that we've kind of tended to either come up with way too many segments that are not meaningfully different. You know, let's talk about the industry versus job role or department. And, you know, you end up with this massive matrix, and it's like, but does that actually matter? And most of the time the answer is no, but people don't really want to hear that anyway. But I think the flip side of that is, you know, we tend to create large groupings because it's easier to do that. And sometimes those large groupings are actually what matters. That's where you have the meaningful difference between different customer segments, but occasionally you come across small but very meaningfully different customer segments. And I think what you're pointing to, Michael, is the need for us to do that. And now I think we increasingly have the ability to do that and to really test and understand, you know, what is it that makes these customer segments distinct, or audience segments, if we want to be a little bit more accurate here. And, you know, this is the thing that actually yields powerful insight. And if you aren't deriving insight from this stuff, you probably are not going to be in business for the long term.
No, it is. And the right insights. But which are then the metrics you would look at? I mean, after all, you're providing me with content in order to, well, maybe not help me, but help you make business, which actually should start with helping me.
Yeah.
So it means you somehow need to improve or provide me with a good with a good engagement so that I have a good experience.
Yeah.
I need to look at better wording there because this gets clunky.
Well, but I mean, context and relevance, right? That's always been the case in content, is serving up the right thing at the right time to the right person.
How to determine that,
right?
Well, and I mean, the interesting thing too is what I think we're starting to see happen, and the challenge of vocabulary is a really, really big one, Thomas, especially in the world of content, because that term does not have very specific inherent meanings, and it gets used to cover a wide range of things. And it's not until we start getting into the specifics that we really get into the important distinctions here, right? But there aren't consistent definitions for this stuff. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. But we have to get better at understanding what the actual distinctions are. And yet at the same time, recognizing where some of those lines are blurring. So I think, for example, we can talk about, real-time dynamic personalized content. One of the things that's so interesting about this, and coming back to the agentic thing, is, present me with information that is relevant to exactly what I'm interested in, and answer my question. Don't answer a question like mine. And this is where I think the boundary between what is customer service, what is marketing, what is product information, all of these things start to get much blurrier. And it comes back to some really significant questions about, how do you manage, what are the systems that you need in order to create and manage the inputs, the content inputs that flow into this stuff, and to understand what comes out at the other side. And that is actually really significant.
No, because kind of a funny dichotomy again. So a bit earlier you said one-to-one might not be that relevant, and I fully agree to that. So right now you just said answer not a question like mine, but mine, which actually is one-to-one.
Yeah, so it is.
Where's one-to-one important and where not?
Well, and I think the thing is, these things are really adjacent to each other, right? Because I want you to answer my question, but I might be interested in understanding what other people have asked that is similar to mine. And this for me comes back to the core of, is one-to-one relevant? And, like a good analyst, my answer is yes and no. But the reality is, in some cases, it's very important. And in others, it's not. And the reason I say that is because we as social creatures strive to belong. We want to be part of a community, right? We don't necessarily want to exist in splendid isolation. And I think one of the things that is a really powerful social question of our time is, are we just creating so many echo chambers that we're actually dividing people in so many ways rather than bringing them together? And, this is actually a pretty meaningful underlying dynamic in our society right now, right? This division is real, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we aren't seeing the same things. And yes, this absolutely applies to things like news and information, but even like the popular culture stuff that makes us feel like we have some shared understanding of the world that we live in. And, honestly, a lot of that comes down to things like advertising. So do you really want to do one-to-one on that? I would argue that actually is a path we want to be very, very considered about going down.
How to identify when one-to-one is relevant? Because I as a provider, can't even assume that my customer or my prospect, my conversation partner, asked the question that they actually wanted to ask.
Yeah. I asked something, but is it really what I meant? Yes, it's true.
Well, and the thing is, it depends on on where you are too, right? There are times when personalization in a segment's fine, but then there are other times when I really do want individualized interaction.
Yes.
And it just depends on where it is and what it is and the value to me and all those other things, right?
But this is where hopefully what we're illustrating here is that there is still an awful lot of critical thought that needs to go into the design and application of these tools. Because just assuming that AI or even AI agents are going to magic up the right experience, I think is, again, I mean, it's delusional. It's really naive, and naive in a potentially very dangerous way.
Well, one of the things that I was doing some research on language models last year, and there's been all sorts of things that come out about them, like, specialized models, vertically focused models, functional models, or small, medium, large. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is taking a large language model, training it on human behavior, and creating a large behavioral model, so that in the back end you are actually taking that real-time data and interpreting it more effectively, and over time much more effectively, right? Because it would continue to learn.
I think this stuff is fascinating. I mean, there's so much we're learning here, and there's bastardized version of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, but simply by trying to measure this stuff, we're actually influencing the system, right? This is the other really challenging part. There's a coevolution happening. I mean, I think you guys probably saw the your brain on Chat GPT stuff. I mean, it is not surprising at all to me that the way that we interact with these tools is changing the way we think. That's, I mean, my answer is, of course. Why would we expect anything otherwise? But understanding how, and maybe having a sense of whether there are any positive or negative implications for that, and there are both, of course, but how do we want to manage that? How do we want to influence that going forward? And what do we need to understand in order to in order to get to the best human outcome, the best business outcome, and all of this stuff too. I mean, you get the kind of firebrands that talk about it dumbing down everything, and everything becomes AI slop. And do we have examples of this? Sure, we absolutely do. But at the same time, I think I see so many people that are becoming so creative in how they use these things. And it's just like, the fact that most people can't remember phone numbers anymore. Most people can't navigate their way through a town. I mean, I am old enough to have had the Thomas Brothers map of Southern California. And you really had to know how to read that thing to even navigate, right? Nobody does that anymore because we are all following GPS. And so we don't have the same grid cells in our brains that help us to navigate without those things, right?
Yeah, but see, I would argue, Nicole, that's not a degradation. That's just
exactly.
And I think that's the part. When I read that MIT study recently, I was like, oh yeah, but because I'm not so sure that doing things differently is bad or good. It's just different.
Well, what was the quote? I think it was Plato who was concerned that writing was going to lead to the degradation of memory.
Yeah, clearly,
and sure. It did, but it also opened up in tremendous new realms that would not have been possible otherwise. So I think you're exactly right. And are there drawbacks to this? Yes. Are there also huge advantages to be had? Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's take this back because we're getting nearer the end of the time we have allotted, and we probably went through 2 of the 10 questions that we put out there, but one, which is fine, right? It's a good conversation. But the one thing that I am really curious about, can we take this back to the basics? If I'm a company, I'm a new company, I'm a startup, or I'm a company trying to do a shift into this personalized content, what should I do? What are the things that I need to look at? What should I do?
I would say the first thing is look at systems that are going to be adaptive enough to help you manage this transition period, because it's going to be a long period of transition. And there's a whole lot of stuff we may be able to see like far out into the future, but there's going to be a lot of stuff that happens in the near term that is hard to predict. So I would say adaptability in your thinking and in your systems is going to be essential. So look for tools that have that flexibility. I would also say, think about what the core principles are that you're trying to support, because one of the dynamics that I observed at Contentful, and I saw this across the set of tools that Contentful operates within, and I mean that ecosystem, but also competitively, they're tremendously flexible. And it's great if you have a clear idea of what you're trying to do. The challenge often becomes if you just want to get something set up and running. And those templates can be incredibly powerful, but they also can be somewhat restrictive. So I think understanding where you're trying to build on some stuff with some fairly straightforward building blocks, but where you need to focus on your own flexibility is going to be helpful too, because I think there's a constant trade-off between, standard versus non-standard, quickly implemented versus something that might be more time-consuming, but where the process of going through that gets you to a much more effective outcome. And I think if you go in with this kind of mindset that this is how both your processes and your systems are going to work, I think that will serve you well for kind of having that outlook to identify where those opportunities are and to be in a constant kind of frame of mind to be adapting to those things along the way.
I mean, it sounds like it's similar advice we would have given to any sort of system implementation, right? You should figure out what it is you want it to do before you do anything, and then build to get to that outcome.
Yes, it's one of those things that's easy to say and much harder to do.
It's very hard to do. Yeah.
What I just wanted to ask, how do you combine this constant flux with a long-term plan?
I think this is where, being part of an ecosystem is key, because you need to have the benefit of others who have seen some of these patterns before. And that might be services partners, that might be, combinations of software tools, all of the above. I think being part of a community of people that have applied this stuff in some way, shape, or form is essential. Don't go it alone is my big answer here, because there is a wealth of experience and knowledge out there that has huge application. And there are a lot of people that are very willing to share this stuff, sometimes gratis, in some meaningful ways. So find those people, find those networks, because they are incredibly useful and powerful. The other thing that I've noticed too is that you learn so much from seeing how other people are using this stuff, whether it's AI tools or anything else. And I think that sort of cross-pollination is priceless.
Yeah, one of the things that excites me about agentic AI, and I've spent a whole bunch of time in that over the last 6 months, is this idea that we're shifting from having to tell something to do a specific thing to telling something what outcome you want and having it go figure out how to do the thing. I mean, that's pretty exciting. If it works.
Is very exciting. It's very exciting. And it's interesting because it's one of those things too, where again, are we going to lose some depth of understanding of how the underlying processes work? Among a lot of people, yes. Yeah. But does it matter? Maybe not, because they're going to be able to do something totally different because they're not kind of wedded to having to know this stuff. They can free their minds to do other things. And I think it's very likely that we'll get to some different ways of processing these things because we can, one of the things we used to talk about in content terms is things like building dynamic taxonomies. If you really want to get bored quickly, we can have a taxonomy and ontology.
Oh yeah. No, I'm an old taxonomy nerd from my IDC days. So
but, like taxonomies, fairly static taxonomies are really important for people, but dynamic taxonomies are something that AI tools particularly are excellent at doing. Yeah. And it's probably somewhere in the combination of these things that we're going to get to some really powerful tools.
Yeah, we need some, as long as there are some guidelines and some rails to adhere to. So, as there's a brand involved, the taxonomy should change too drastically. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, I think some degree of change. This is what we kind of got to collectively. Stasis is bad. A static taxonomy is not good. You want some degree of change, but it should be a manageable degree of change.
Yeah. Yeah, this is too fast. Actually, 45 minutes are
speaking of too fast.
We didn't speak fast enough. Just didn't speak fast
that always happens.
I'll work on that next
time. But let's save the rest for a sequel. That's probably a good idea.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks for your time and wisdom, Nicole. So what I can say for certain, for sure, is that you survived the hot seat. So
Thank you.
Thank goodness.
It's a little better than
I hate it when we kill the guest. That's just bad.
Not that we expected otherwise, but
I'm not dead. I'm just very badly burned. Yeah.
yeah, we can confirm. So,
Yeah, this was great. Thank you guys. This has been an absolute pleasure.
To our audience, thanks for coping with us in nerding out for 45 minutes here, geeking out. And if you do think you have what it takes to be Nicole, be in the hot seat.
Well, I don't think they could be Nicole, but they could be in the hot seat.
So she put the bar incredibly high now. So,
exactly. Flattery. I'll take every bit of it.
Yeah. So as said, we'd love to hear that. And else, this is our episode for today. Thanks so much for being with us. And I'm Thomas Wieberneit.
I'm Michael Fauscette. Tune in next time for different faces, different topics, different perspectives as we put somebody else in the hot seat.